Hi, my name's Virgo, and I am an author and mental health campaigner. I basically spend my time kind of traveling all over the place, doing a lot of work with schools, corporates, and hospitals, and then also do a lot of work with the government, particularly on issues around eating disorders, but also looking a little bit more broadly at that kind of whole spectrum of mental health, really getting people to understand about managing their own well-being, but also making sure that when people do reach out for support, that actually the right support is in place for them as well. So today we're going to be looking at self-esteem. Self-esteem is obviously something that every single person has, and throughout life things will happen and maybe words will be said to us, or we'll have feelings around ourselves that will impact whether we have positive or negative self-esteem. So self-esteem is how we value and perceive ourselves. It's based on our opinions and beliefs about ourselves, which can sometimes feel really, really difficult to change. I'm sure I'm not the only person who's maybe had those moments in life where your self-esteem feels really, really low and really challenging to think about. And you're kind of trying to work out like what's caused that, how it's going, how are you going to ever get to that space where it feels okay again, where maybe things will feel fine. But I really, really want you kind of off the back of the session today to just know that actually you can get to that space where actually your self-esteem can be in a really positive space. It isn't just something that happens to certain people who look a certain type of, look a certain way, or those people who maybe we categorize in this kind of really strong category, or people who are really together. But I believe that every single person can get to that space where actually their self-esteem can feel really, really positive, but also really manageable. And you're able to accept yourself as you are. So thinking back over your own lives, I want you to think about what has impacted your own self-esteem. Maybe thinking about creating a bit of a timeline of events, thinking about those times that maybe you began to question what you looked like, or whether you were good enough, or whether you were good at school, or whether someone said something to you. Have a bit of a think about that. There are so many things at play when it comes to our self-esteem, and things that can have that huge impact. For starters, we know that being bullied or abused can have those impacts. When I was growing up, I was sexually abused for around 8-9 months. And when it finished, I was just so unable to process what had happened. But on top of that, I was left with these feelings that there was something categorically wrong with who I was. And this is why that had happened. That abuse meant that my self-esteem pretty much plummeted. And I did everything I could to try and give myself that quick fix, to try and make myself feel okay. For me, that came out in the form of food restriction and obsessive exercise. And I ended up over kind of like this 4-year period developing anorexia. But you don't have to be bullied or go through abuse to have those kind of negative impacts on our self-esteem. It could be that you've experienced some sort of discrimination or prejudice or stigma. And maybe you're sitting with those feelings that there's something wrong with you, something wrong with who you are, and that then impacts our self-esteem extremely negatively. And you're trying to change that. Other factors at play could be things to do with stress, so maybe how you're getting on at school or college, maybe that stress from that day-to-day stuff, maybe even the stress of the pandemic. Physical or mental health problems also kind of interplay and definitely contribute in certain factors. You have the link between self-esteem and body image, but also again, linking that into social media too. Actually, how does our body image interplay with our relationship with social media, and then consequently our relationship with ourselves? Are we feeling like we don't fit in, or we don't look the way that we're supposed to look, or we don't fit into that kind of modern societal ideal that we're so often plastered with and told we have to fit into? And again, all of these things can have this hugely negative impact on our self-esteem if we're not surrounding ourselves with the right people, or they're looking at the right things. We've got that constant comparisons and kind of self-judgment. And the reality is when we compare ourselves to other people, we always end up in a much worse off position. I know that I do it. I can spend hours scrolling on things like social media, and I'm in that kind of comparison trap. But even when I'm like walking down the street maybe, or I'm out with my friends, maybe I kind of compare a little bit. And before I know it, again, I'm kind of in that kind of self-critical space. We have that kind of narrative, don't we, that we tell ourselves, that kind of constant body talk, but also the body checking. And I think, again, with the pandemic, this has probably got slightly worse. We're spending time on things like video calls a lot of the time. And I know for me, kind of doing a lot of my workshops online, and I can spend the entire session like talking to you guys and like engaging, obviously, but then at the same time, like we'll be kind of occasionally looking at my face, kind of judging myself, thinking, does my hair sit right? Should I have maybe put contact lenses in today? Maybe I should have put a little bit more makeup on, or maybe picked a different colored jumper, or, and before you know it, you're down like this kind of trap. And I think, again, like in so many situations, we see that then kind of that body talk and that narrative starts to create in our head, and maybe then links back to that comparison. You're on a screen with all your other kind of friends, and you're kind of comparing their face structure to your face structure. And it can feel really, really difficult and really, really hard to navigate in that situation. We've also got that kind of body checking, which often follows on from the body talk. And I know, again, that with body image particularly, it's a projection of our feelings and our emotions. But often when we're feeling uncomfortable, we start to kind of project it onto our bodies. Maybe we kind of lift up our jumper every now and again and kind of start to body check, start to kind of see, oh, actually, does that feel right? Do I feel the same today? Does this feel different? And I know for me, actually, in the pandemic, I went through this kind of phase where I was just body checking pretty much all the time. It was probably over, I don't know, a 6 week to 8 week period. And I had this rash, and I felt so self-conscious that my way of dealing with it was to be body checking. But I didn't know then what to really do with a lot of that emotion and a lot of that fear around it. So actually every time then I started to kind of be tempted to body check, whether it was sitting down at the table and kind of, or going into the bedroom, kind of looking in the mirror, I would instead go and make myself like a cup of tea or get a glass of water, and getting to that space where I then wasn't as kind of tempted and as desperate to be body checking all the time. Because again, when we body check, we always make ourselves feel so much worse. And then again, that kind of just modern societal ideals, which we've kind of touched on slightly with the social media, with the body image. But that modern societal ideals often play into those feelings, don't they? Where we feel like there's something so wrong with us and we're not fitting up to society's expectations, and putting that pressure on ourselves on that day-to-day basis can feel really, really challenging and leave us with all of those feelings that there is something the matter with us. Just quickly, kind of looking specifically at the kind of relationship between body image and self-esteem, because I do think it is very, very connected in kind of so many ways. But remember what I said about body image being this kind of projection of our feelings and our emotions onto our bodies. Often when we look in the mirror and we say things like, I feel really heavy today, we know that heavy isn't really a feeling. So it's like, what is actually going on? What is having that impact on us kind of internally? Is it anger? Is it guilt? Is it frustration? Is it that we're in the middle of an argument with someone, or that we're feeling really uncertain? Or are we still trying to get some of our self-worth, some of that worth that we need for our self-esteem from our bodies? We need to remember that there is so much more to us than our bodies. And actually, we need to find a way to kind of really interrupt a lot of that thinking when it comes to that kind of linkage between body image and self-esteem as well. A big question that I always have for people is, what narrative are you currently telling yourself? I think, again, that kind of internal tape player that can so often start off. We're lying in bed in the evening, aren't we? And we've had a bit of a bad day, and we kind of reflect on the day, not feeling great about it, kind of maybe slightly anxious, maybe there's been stuff going on. And then before you know it, you're like 6 years back into your life, and you're in a kind of the grips of this conversation that you had with someone. Then you go back a couple more years maybe, and there's a comment that someone made in the playground. And then you're then looking at all of the evidence around you, all of that evidence that maybe it's kind of like that evidence that, oh, actually, there is something wrong with me. Oh, there's something that matters with me. And then that will then interplay on our self-esteem as well. It's really, really important that we're thinking about that narrative. I know that you're probably sitting there thinking, it's so easy for you to say that. It's so easy for you to be like, oh, what's the narrative? What can we do about it? But actually, I've spent a lot of my life with that really, really toxic and really dangerous narrative. That narrative that I mentioned at the start, which for me stemmed from abuse, but for you guys, it could have stemmed from anything, from the social media usage, from friends, from comments, from being bullied, anything like that, where you feel like there's something wrong with you. And that's the thing you have to change. I had so many years where I was just constantly telling myself that narrative, looking for that way out, thinking that if I just changed my body enough, then everything would be fine. If I just lost a little bit more weight, then somehow I'd feel okay, and everyone would be kind of okay, and I'd be good enough, and I'd be more lovable, and life would be great. And yes, eating disorders particularly is so much more complex than just about that. They're about numbing emotion. They're serving a purpose for that person. They're giving them that sense of value. But actually for me, that was all wrapped up into this one kind of factor. And a lot of it was around that kind of self-worth and that communication as well. We have to get to a space where we're able to think about, actually, what are we feeding ourselves? What narratives are we telling ourselves on that day-to-day basis? What things are we looking at online that is feeding into that narrative? What things are we telling ourselves when we look in the mirror, or we get a grade back, or we write a piece of kind of classwork, or we do a presentation? Are we honing in on all of those negatives, that kind of constantly self-criticizing ourselves? Or are we able to kind of look at it kind of and just be like, actually, do you know what? That isn't evidence. Particularly, actually, if someone has an opinion of us. I think so often in life, we take everyone else's opinions as completely factual, when that is not the way to do it. Their opinion is not a factual thing. And we need to get to a space where we're able to distance ourselves from that slightly. For me, it's always really important to realize that there are a couple of really, really key signs to be looking out for when it comes to our own self-esteem. When you have particularly low self-esteem, you might not be taking care of yourself. Maybe you stop washing your hair, you stop brushing your teeth, you stop making the effort to get dressed every day. Maybe over the pandemic, you've got into that cycle where you feel so uncomfortable in your body that maybe you're just wearing kind of trackies or hoodies all the time as a way to kind of deal with all of those emotions and all of those feelings around your body. You're kind of sinking away into yourself because your self-esteem has got so low that you don't really feel like maybe you're worthy of something. A lot of people with low self-esteem lack those boundaries. They let people kind of, I don't know, dictate that kind of timing in that day to day. They don't really feel like they're worth anything to put those boundaries in place, even if they know those boundaries are having a negative, not the lack of boundaries, are having a negative impact on them. People with low self-esteem also find it really hard to say positive things about themselves. And again, I know it's can be so difficult in society. We live in that world, don't we, where people are constantly criticizing, kind of we're constantly critiquing ourselves. And if you have too good self-esteem, then people are kind of judging you and questioning you. And it can feel like a complete and utter minefield so much of the time. But actually, we need to get to a space where we can own that and actually feel like we can at least be neutral towards ourselves. Yes, one day it'd be amazing if we could all have those positive affirmations. But if you're someone who cannot ever find anything positive to say, or maybe you find it really difficult, or you find it so uncomfortable and struggle a lot, again, that is when your self-esteem is kind of slightly on the low side, and maybe it's a bit of a red flag. If you're someone who's constantly in that comparison game, and again, yes, I know so many of us do it, but it's when it's kind of having that interplay, it means that maybe it stops us going out and about in the evening with our friends. Maybe you go on social media before a night out and you realize that actually, oh, I don't look like anyone else, or I don't look as good as everyone else. And that narrative starts, and then you go into that comparison factor, and then you withdraw from that situation. Linking back to the boundaries, it's about not saying what you want. It's about letting people just decide and dictate everything else. You are worth so much more than that. And when we get to a space where we feel more comfortable in our self-esteem, and our self-esteem raises and our self-worth raises, then again, you can get to that space where actually you start saying what you need in that moment. And then the other thing is kind of blaming yourself when things go wrong. And again, I know that I've done this in the past, and maybe still do in places actually, with certain people or certain situations. And you put all that kind of onus on yourself. You blame yourself on a day-to-day basis when maybe there's a bad grade or you have an argument with someone. And then that narrative begins again. And you end up with those feelings that it's all your fault. There's something wrong with you. And that's why this has happened. I want you to take that moment to just think about kind of your own relationship with yourself. What do you currently get your self-worth from? What would you say your self-esteem is like? Honestly, what it is like. You don't have to tell anyone, but just kind of think about, actually, what of these factors do you see in yourself that might be a sign that maybe you need to work a little bit more on that self-esteem? Are you not washing your hair at the moment, or not cleaning your teeth, not getting dressed in the mornings? Are you not doing that kind of self-care and showing yourself that love and that kindness? Or are you letting others completely dictate that day to day, kind of lacking in that self-esteem in that sense, lacking in that self-worth? Or has it got to the point now where you pretty much find it easier to withdraw from a situation because you're afraid of actually that comparison, of that judgment, of what people will say, what people will think? But like I always say, it isn't all bad news, is it? There are things that we can do. And this stuff firstly, takes time. It isn't like I can give you a 3-point plan to be like, right, if you do these 3 things on a week-to-week, day-to-day basis, then somehow everything will be fine. This stuff takes time and practice and so much discipline. And in places, it can be really, really uncomfortable. The first thing that we need to be thinking about is how to interrupt those negative thoughts. For me, there are a couple of ways that I've done this in the past, which really, really help. The first thing is actually making a list of all of those negative thoughts that I have, kind of calling them out on one side of a piece of paper. On the other side of the paper, looking at whether there is actually any evidence for that. I'm sure you can all reply to that and be like, yes, there's so much evidence for why I feel this way. But actually, we need to get to a space where actually we remember that that evidence isn't actually factual evidence. And a lot of the time, our brain can distort that evidence, kind of creating and making those narratives that maybe we want to hear, or we tell ourselves we want to hear. I make that list, and then on the other side of the paper, I write down a load of positive affirmations. I write down all those things that maybe I'm proud of, that I've done good in my life, that maybe I like. And a lot of the time, I actually move away from that focus on my body and actually think a little bit more broadly about it. When we have those negative thoughts, we need to get to that space or we're just immediately able to interrupt it. I got into a habit actually, again, during the pandemic, where pretty much every time in the shower, I would kind of look down at myself and I would be so critical and so judgmental. After a couple of kind of probably months actually of doing this, I was like, this is not helping me and it's not helping anyone else. So every time I kind of looked down at myself and had those thoughts, I would immediately try and interrupt it. Again, thinking about things that maybe I had to do work-wise, thinking about campaigning, and getting to that space where actually I could actually come back with a positive affirmation. That stuff takes time, but it's about training ourselves to do that. And you might feel really silly kind of when you look down at yourself and you come back with that positive affirmation. And yes, it does feel slightly uncomfortable, but the more we train ourselves to do that, actually the better it will be. The second thing that's really, really helpful is, and I hate this expression, but kind of becoming a little bit of your own cheerleader. I also call it kind of reparenting yourself. There are so many things that happen on a day-to-day basis that maybe we want someone to kind of comment on, or things that we want to share, or that response we want to get. I probably spend one evening a week when I'm lying in bed, actually saying all these positive stuff to myself, kind of congratulating myself on things, kind of getting to that space where I'm able to tell myself those things that maybe I haven't heard from others, or that maybe others have said to me, but I want to tell myself again. Reparenting ourselves, whether you've had a dysfunctional relationships at home or not, is a really, really good way to actually start really championing yourself. We need to prioritize showing ourselves kindness. In all of this, it's a process. So don't beat yourself up if you have a bad day or you kind of get that negative mind track again. But it's about showing yourself kindness throughout all of that. It's about taking that time to kind of keep your hygiene up, to, I don't know, paint your nails, to go and do some self-care. Give yourself that space to watch something on the TV if you want to. Allowing yourself that kind of quiet time. For me, I journal a lot. And actually, for me, allowing myself that space to journal shows that actually I'm prioritizing kind of my well-being as well. We need to get to a space where we're able to predict when that narrative is going to be really, really difficult in our heads. I think, again, so often we kind of go through these things in life, don't we, where they cause us like so much fear and anxiety. And before we know it, we've kind of walked into a situation and our self-esteem feels really, really low. We need to start realizing that actually so much of the time that is linked to our feelings and our emotions. And how can we respond when we're in that kind of more well place? I know for me now that when I go into situations of heightened stress or anxiety, that actually often I will have very bad body image that day. I'll kind of withdraw slightly, maybe go into a bit of a survival mode. And actually now in those moments, I'm able to actually kind of, most of the time, not every time, but most of the time, predict how I'm going to be. And then I'm able to actually have these kind of go-to mantras, these go-to things that I can tell myself in that moment, reminding myself that I'm so much more than my body, reminding myself that my self-worth isn't defined by someone else. And having that stuff to hand is really, really helpful. For you guys, it could be any time of the year that you have these situations. It could be going to a funeral, it could be Christmas, it could be in the summer. All of that could be that kind of predicament where you're like, actually, I predict that my narrative that I'm going to start to tell myself is going to be really, really difficult. So what can I do? What steps can I put in place in that moment to actually really, really help? Every single week, it might be about taking that time to list those things that you're proud of, those things that maybe you've done well, kind of shouting out to yourself a little bit, looking at that evidence again. You don't have to make a really long list, but it is about kind of naming a couple of those things. And I think within that, kind of finding those things that you're grateful for, actually kind of turning that kind of low self-esteem and angst and fear into that gratitude. When you wake up in the middle of the night and maybe you're kind of going down that self-esteem route, it might be that you go through every single thing in the alphabet, every single letter in the alphabet even, and kind of list off those things you're grateful. It's something that I do. I don't not often get to Z. I don't think I've ever got that far. I normally fall back to sleep, but it helps to kind of interrupt that kind of self-esteem, like low self-esteem narrative that we often tell ourselves. It's about diversifying what we're looking at. Yes, not just on social media, but in the media generally, kind of making sure that we're looking at a huge range of content, but also things that really inspire us. We need to stop looking and following people based on what they look like, but actually do it based on what they're doing with their lives. Like those people that maybe, like I said, inspire you. You need to remember that actually when you walk into a room, no one is judging what you look like. No one is judging kind of your past history. They just want to see you a lot of the time. And reminding yourself of those sort of things can be really, really helpful. And the final thing is to just surround yourself with the right people. I think, again, so much of the time when we have low self-esteem, we lack those boundaries, don't we? And we spend time with people who maybe stress us out or cause us that anxiety. But it's about surrounding yourself with people that make you glow. You will have those people in mind. I have them in my mind. People that when I see them, I come back and I'm like loving life and I'm feeling really good. And yes, they challenge me and in places they might call me out on stuff. But it is about creating kind of that space where you've got those people in your lives as well, knowing that you are so worth that too. If you leave a social situation and you feel down, you feel unhappy, your self-esteem is starting to plummet again, that's a red sign that maybe you're not kind of surrounding yourself with the right sorts of people. And again, it can be challenging, particularly if you've been friends with people for a while, but it's about creating that space that really, really works for you. And if you have to go into that situation, which sometimes we do, having all of this backup stuff available, having the mantras, having that space to show yourself kindness, predicting the narrative, kind of knowing your self-worth within that. And it, like I said, it takes time, but it does get easier the more we work on this sort of stuff. So if anything has come up for you today, anything that maybe has caused you to kind of question your own relationship with your self-esteem, maybe you feel like, and I know there's been a lot of information shared, you're like, oh, I don't know where to start, I don't know where to go. Again, kind of taking that time to maybe list off a couple of things that you can do to really start that process. Maybe start by making that list of all of those kind of negative thoughts you have. And on the other side, making that positive list. Take that time to really start valuing yourself. And I guarantee that you will start to see all of the kind of positive effects of that as well. And if you want to find out a little bit more information about kind of self-esteem, our self-worth, our body image, again, looking at organizations like The Mix, where there is so many amazing resources, kind of Q&As, chat functions, things like that. But if it has hit home with you today and you're kind of like, do you know what, this is having such a huge detrimental impact on my life. Maybe it's affecting your food, your exercise, maybe it's affecting your social life or what you do on a day-to-day basis. I would really, really encourage you to use this as a bit of an opportunity to actually reach out for that support. So maybe have a little bit of a think about actually what is going on. Some of this stuff we can think about really practically, like I've said, with kind of those kind of plans in place to try and change things. But sometimes we have to get to the nitty gritty of it. And I know for me, the only way that I could really heal from a lot of this stuff was to go through therapy and have kind of years and years of that kind of intense therapy, trying to kind of unpack it, trying to gain that kind of self-worth that I really, really deserved. And you guys as well, like you deserve to have that therapy. Your self-esteem might be so low that you don't think you have that time, you can't prioritize it. But we need to get to that space where we can prioritize ourselves and then actually prevent things escalating as well. But thank you everyone for listening today. I hope you found it interesting and insightful. My contact details are on the screen. So if there is something that I've said today that has kind of resonated or hit a nerve a little bit, or maybe you've just got some more questions to ask, do feel free to kind of reach out and let me know. And also would also love to hear like how you're getting on with it or kind of how that plan is going to really increase your self-worth and your self-esteem as well. But thanks everyone for listening.